Hi, I'm Frank Harmon, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Frank Lloyd Wright, now 60 years after his death, remains the most well-known architect in America, perhaps the world. He was notorious for his ego, which was matched only by his genius and talent, which is another way of saying that Wright would be delighted to be this famous for so long. Wright would say, and he really did, that he was the greatest architect ever, and for many, he was and still is. Roland Reisley was only 26 when he became Frank Lloyd Wright's client for a small house in upstate New York. Now Reisley is the last living client of Wright, still in the same lovely house, part of a small colony of Wright houses known as Usonia in upstate New York. The Usonian houses were the prototype for small, affordable houses across America in a post-war time when affordable housing was needed. Unfortunately, the Usonians were not particularly economical nor small, but they remain beautiful designs that people rarely want to leave. Our George Smart was on the road and sat down with Roland Reisley at his lovely Usonian house, although it was a bit of a surprise for Roland, and we'll find out why in a moment. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by modernist realtor Angela Roll and our new sponsor, Nichiha.
Beauty, love, durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color. Wood, concrete. Your house loves feeling this good. And you love feeling this good. Nichiha, 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 Nichiha. Say it with me. Nichiha. Advanced engineering. Nichiha, Nichiha. Durability, textures, finishes, and colors. Visit Nichiha.com/US Modernist. Nichiha, Nichiha, Nichiha. That's N-I-C-H. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nichiha.
Roland Reisley's house was built in Pleasantville, New York in 1951. It was the third of the Usonia homes by architect Frank Lloyd Wright. It originally had one bedroom, a study, and a kitchen for 1,800 square feet. In 1956, Frank Lloyd Wright returned to design a 1,400 square foot addition for Roland. Both were over budget. Way over budget. We join George as he pulls into Roland Reisley's driveway in Pleasantville.
Hi, I'm George.
Oh,
Are you Roland?
I'm Roland.
Wonderful. Nice to meet you.
I thought you were talking about a telephone interview.
No,
Personal interview.
personal.
Come
You're
on
in
in.
town. Is this okay?
Sure.
Oh, wonderful.
I don't know why I thought it was a telephone.
Well, I was going to be in town anyway. That's why I called you to try to arrange it for this particular day.
Fine. Here we are. Come on in.
Here we are. Wow. This is the first Usonian house I've been in. I've been in a lot of Wright buildings and houses, but not this neighborhood before.
Wright designed the site plan for this neighborhood. He actually designed 5 houses here. 2 of them were not built because the clients sensibly decided they were too expensive. Most of the houses were designed by architects who were apprentices of his or disciples of his, nominally subject to his approval.
Sure.
So that the houses have a kind of a certain similarity. They're of the land, not on it. You don't see foundation planting and so on and so forth. And they're mostly natural material, which it's a whole long story.
What year is this house?
This house?
This house, yeah.
Was designed in 1951.
And you've been here the entire time?
Yeah.
Wow. That's a record of some kind.
I don't know. It's a long time.
I think so, yeah.
Have a chair.
Okay, wonderful.
I'll give you the tour whenever you're
Okay.
ready. You can do it now or later.
Well, let's talk first.
All right.
Let's start at the beginning with you.
My connection with this house and this community is as follows. My wife and I were married in 1950. We were only children. We lived in New York City. We wanted to put down roots someplace and start a family. And we're looking around. If we saw something that we liked, we couldn't afford it. If we could afford it, we didn't like it. And we heard that there's a community in northern Westchester building affordable houses in a cooperative community supervised by Frank Lloyd Wright. Let's take a look. Just curious.
What could go wrong with that?
Right. So we drove up here to take a look, and there were then about 10 or 11 houses that were nearly completed or just started being lived in. We were greeted with open arms. The people here that met us were so full of enthusiasm and commitment to what they were doing that we were captivated by what they had to say. And we'd been given some money for a wedding trip. Well, let's join Usonia. We put our money in there. When you joined Usonia, you selected a site. We have 100 acres here on which Wright designed, intended 50 home sites. The site plan that he made had 55 circular acre home sites. Circular. And your voice raised question. The whole world raised question. That site plan was published in every newspaper in the United States. The great Frank Lloyd Wright, look what he did here. Circles. Who ever heard of such a thing? The idea was that the circles could not be delineated. We have a covenant that says you can't make up fences or hedgerows or anything else. And the idea was to make these circular acres, which he thought was just about enough for a house, feel as if they're in a much larger space. And that was the intention of no delineation. That he visualized a wooded enclave from one end to the other with narrow winding roads, not to get you from here to there, but to connect you with the land, and with beautiful houses scattered like jewels. That was the scheme. So it got attention. And
Now, with the circular lots, when the circles overlapped, was that common area in between? Is that how it worked?
all the other area, including several large areas that did not have sites, are essentially common land, which is to remain in a near natural state. We have almost 40 acres of land within this 100 acres of land that is determined to be near natural. We can't sell it, we can't build on it.
It's beautiful. I mean, driving down this road is just idyllic.
It is indeed beautiful. Anyway, that's a little back. So you selected a site. You then selected an architect. The architect to be either Frank Lloyd Wright or one of the 5 or 6 young architects who were either had been apprentices or disciples of his. So we were looking at the work of the other architects. I'm 26 years old. You don't just approach Frank Lloyd Wright. That is, one doesn't do that. The founder of this community, David Henkin, had become a friend of ours here, and he said, Mr. Wright's going to be here in a few weeks. I'm going to show him your land and tell him about you. Maybe he'll want to design a house for you. This can't see me, but I point out, in one ear and out the other. But a few weeks later, he called me. He said, he was here. I showed him your land. I told him, call him up. So I called him up, Mr. Wright. And that's how we selected Frank Lloyd Wright.
That must have been a real thrill.
What ensued was a wonderful relationship. everything worked out beautifully. And I like to tell people, I have many visitors, as you can imagine. And most of the people who visit me know something about Frank Lloyd Wright. They know with absolute certitude that he was an arrogant, egocentric man, not a nice person. He left his wife and 5 children, ran off with the wife of a client, didn't pay his bills, his houses cost too much, he didn't pay attention to his clients, his roofs leak, and so on. Oh, well, Falling Water, Guggenheim, great architect. No awareness whatsoever of the hundreds of wonderful buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. But this sense of his difficult persona is one that most people who know something about him assume to be fact. Well, we had none of those experiences at all. We got along very, very well with him. I remember in particular when he sent us the first set of preliminary drawings for our project here. My wife said, but look, there's no broom closet. And we told him we have a lot of books. He didn't provide not much book space for us. So Mr. Wright was then staying at his apartment in the Plaza Hotel. So I went down to see him. You know, by then I had already met him a couple of times, but it was still not comfortable. You know, pardon me for breathing up your air, Mr. Wright.
Right.
And he sensed this. He said, come on, Roland. You're my client. I'm your architect. I'll redesign your house as many times as I have to until I've satisfied all of your needs. You have to speak up. Otherwise, you'll take what you get. And that's how it was. And we got along very, very well for the next 5 or 6 years.
How long did it take to construct?
Not all that long. Construction started, I think, in the fall of 1951. And we moved into our not quite finished house in June of 1952. So it was not long. It was about 8 months. Not everything was completed. This outdoor terrace that we're sitting next to had a lot of fill in it. This house, you can't see it in a verbal conversation, but this house is decidedly of the land. You know, when we showed Mr. Wright this site in the first place, we thought the house would be at the top of the hill, nice view over the meadow and so on. And he clambered up there, and he said, "Oh, that's ridiculous. That's just a house on a hill. It should be of the hill." And that's an expression he used many, many times. He wanted his buildings to grow out of the land as though they belonged there naturally, be built of natural materials.
As I look around the room, I see this great stonework and the wood.
Natural materials inside and out.
So the house is finished.
The house was now livable, but there was still some work to be done to finish things off. And in particular, for example, this terrace, it's built over a boulder in which there was some blasting done to get the house into the land. It took a year or two for all of this fill to settle down before we were going to pave it.
After that, did you see Wright or talk to him between 52 and the time he died in 59?
Yes, I did. Well, during the construction, I saw him and spoke with him, and we asked the correspondence several times during the construction because there were questions about this and that. But the house, as I told you, we had just been married. So this house has 1 bedroom. That's how it was, with dotted lines for future changes or additions. In 1956, with 2.5 children, we said, Mr. Wright, it's time for the addition. And he then designed the addition that's off here on one side. And that gave us essentially four additional bedrooms. So during those years, talking about the addition and then the construction, I visited him in Wisconsin and another occasion in Arizona. I was with him one day at the site of the Guggenheim Museum when he was having some interesting conversations with the city building code people.
I'm sure that was interesting.
Yes.
That was a long project for him.
Yeah. When they tore down the building that was on that site originally, Wright had an exhibition called 60 Years of Living Architecture constructed on that site. And it had lot of photographs and drawings, and actually a small actual house. It was built of proper materials and so on. It wasn't permanent functioning. It didn't have heat and plumbing and so on. But the building was there. You could see it, and you could have the feel of being in the space. And, then it was time to continue to get going with the excavation. So now the excavation had been taking place, and Mr. Wright was on the site with the building department people who were essentially saying that the oculus at the top of the museum can't be of glass because the glass is not specified to withstand snow loads and things of that kind. It's going to have to be wired glass, the glass with the chicken wire in it. Mr. Wright would have no part of that, absolutely not. That's ugly. He was not going to stand for that. And these young men from the building department, in the presence of the great man, were trying to be diplomatic and make the points they had to make, but they were not comfortable about it, but they were insisting. So he said, well, how about we use corrugated fiberglass? At least that's not an objectionable material. Well, they were not at all certain if that's a possibility or legal material. They decided they're going to have a shootout. So the next day they had set up sheets of the wired glass and sheets of the plastic, and they're piling them up with sandbags essentially to create a test load. And the fiberglass sinks like an old mule. The wired glass sinks a little bit, but the bending fiberglass is okay. And they said, see? And then the glass exploded. So they used the wired glass.
Even though it exploded?
Even though it exploded. Because it had a far beyond the real load that was going.
Right.
It had to face. Well, the museum, with Wright's insistence, then put translucent shades or things over the oculus because they didn't want to see that pattern. Turns out, jump ahead a couple of decades, when the museum was being renovated, there is now glass available that was legal and would stand up in that. So it now has glass in it that is legal glass. But they continue to use the translucent shades because they decided they didn't want the direct sunlight coming in through the glass and possibly having adverse impact on some of the objects in the museum. But anyway, we're talking about Frank Lloyd Wright. That's a complete digression, but I had a nice relationship with him.
When did you start to know that your house was special and people wanted to come see it?
Well, early on, when this community, there were large stories. There were big spreads in the Times and the Tribune and Architectural Forum in various places about the whole community, not necessarily about this house. A lot of attention was given to the first of the three Wright houses here in the community. It was the Freedman House, and it was a large, interesting circular stone house, which was something quite new for Wright at the time. So it, along with progress in the construction of the community, got a lot of press coverage. So there was much awareness, and we get thousands of people driving up here. When you drove in, you drove through suburbia, which is oozing up against us. But we were surrounded then by estates. This was way out in the country. But people took the trouble to get here, so we had a lot of visitors coming through to see the community. Yeah, of course, they were particularly interested in the Wright houses, but they were just interested in the whole thing. That was from day one.
Did more people come after Wright died?
I don't know. It's hard to say. We're talking about now, 67 years in this house. And over these years, relatively few unwelcome visits. Every now and then, somebody knocks on the door. We are architecture students from Finland. Okay, if they look nice, I might let them in, or you can walk around. For the most part, people who are interested in seeing the house, they'd telephone or they'd let a letter, may we come, and that's perfectly okay. In later years, in the last 15, 20 years, I get requests for tour groups and things of that kind, and which I'm happy to accommodate. It's been important to me to try to communicate the essence of Frank Lloyd Wright and his ideas, and to dispel the notion of what a terrible person he was.
I think a lot of people get that perhaps from some of the TV appearances he made late in his life where he came across very arrogantly.
He can come across as arrogant, but that was his public persona. That was not how he was one-on-one and when you were with him personally. But he affected that persona, and I think it served a purpose. The fact that he dressed, the fact that he wore the pork pie hat, he dressed with a cape. I think that he felt that this image, whether or not it was admired entirely, was nevertheless going to make him more recognizable, and it did serve that purpose.
How did your kids feel about growing up here?
I took it for granted. This is where they live. Now and then they'd have friends over who went to see their strange house. But I'm often asked about that, and they now know, of course, that it's a significant house, and etc. But other than that, it was their houses where they lived, and their friends and the world seemed to think there was something unique about it. That was their view.
I've talked to a lot of children who grew up in modernist houses. And sometimes it happens in their 20s, sometimes much later. But they have this aha moment where they realize that this wasn't a normal house that they grew up in. And that everybody else's houses aren't like this in so many ways. And sometimes that's a source of joy for what they grew up in. And sometimes they're really disappointed they don't have a modernist house yet.
Well, I've never had that particular conversation with my son. I might do it one of these days, or some interviewer might do it. I'm sure he's been asked, but I don't think I've heard the results of it.
Have TV or film crews come out to shoot things here?
Yeah, a fair number of people doing advertising, a certain amount. We had a very interesting piece done for Italian Vogue, which was a story. And they did some shots here for The Girl on the Train, which
the movie, The Girl on the Train, yeah.
The movie. Even though they took a lot of footage here, I think the editors very appropriately dropped most of it, because that story just didn't need to have the distraction of an architecturally curious background. It did not serve their narrative one bit. They did some shooting here, but they did not use much of the footage with the architecture of the house, because it was really, I think that's a smart decision. If filmmakers or advertisers very often want a certain kind of background, and they find it more convenient and less expensive to go find something in the real world rather than creating the set themselves.
Sure.
Saks Fifth Avenue shot a catalog of menswear here. Paid me a lot of money for it. But a picture of a belt on a stone, nothing about the architecture. They're selling belts.
But I guess if you're with this kind of beautiful backdrop, if you've got 100 items to sell, you can put it on different walls and chairs and
they
sofas.
They put them all over the place, but relatively few of their shot. Some of them actually did take advantage of the scene, which was an interesting setting for what they were doing. Actually, they shot here in the springtime and the summertime for their fall catalog. They brought up bales of leaves to throw around on the grass to make it look like the fall.
Oh, that's great.
But
it's like applying makeup to a celebrity. Yeah. You had leaves in your yard.
Right. I mentioned earlier on the misapprehension that I think many people have about Frank Lloyd Wright. During those years when we as a community were building and championing Frank Lloyd Wright, and everybody saw him as a great, great architect, but there was a real dichotomy, essentially a conflict between Wright and his ideas and the then more international style architects.
Philip Johnson,
the white concrete structures that were, the things that the Bauhaus was proud of, and so on.
Gropius,
Royer, the Corbusier. Corbusier was the enemy, and that was the climate in terms of the enthusiastic commitment that all of us had about the Wright's ideas and Wright's community, and what we perceived to be a misguided appreciation of these more industrial kinds of structures. Actually, as a teenager, I learned that good architects consider a house a machine for living. That sounded very good to me, young techie, young fellow. Machine for living, great.
I think that was Corbusier, wasn't it?
I think it may have been.
Yeah.
When we came to appreciate Wright's ideas about the space and the materials and so on, the furthest thing from acceptable was a machine for living. And we saw the Corbusier and Breuer and Gropius style of architecture was at odds. So there was real polarization.
Different schools of thought about modernism.
Right. And Philip Johnson was the enemy. And Corbusier certainly was the enemy. And Wright and Corbusier were on record as having nasty things to say about each other.
Yes.
Philip Johnson finally did come to one of our conferences and say, well, let's face it, he was, after all, the greatest.
And Wright was very withholding on his praise for anybody.
Right.
I mean, there are stories about how architects would take him around to show him their work, to try to get a compliment out of him, and it was very tough.
I was one time driving him back to the city. And we're driving down Fifth Avenue, and the Plaza Hotel looms, and there he says, good old Henry Hardenberg. It's an honest building, he says. Of course, I wouldn't do anything like it. But he acknowledged that it was an honest building by good old Henry Hardenberg.
That's a big compliment for Wright.
Yes. No, he was very well aware of the work of the other architects. And now and then, you'd get some sense of acknowledgement, but he was acknowledging something in the past. He had nothing good to say about contemporary architects. I think he really did believe that he was the greatest architect of all time.
He said it often enough.
He said it all. You know, it's a famous story that he was testifying at a court trial someplace. He was an expert witness. Mr. Wright, what is your profession? I'm the greatest architect in the world. And they're leaving, and Olga Ivana said, Frank, how could you say that? He said, I was under oath.
Certainly over all the time you've lived here, things have broken or had to be fixed or replaced. So how do you decide whether to go back and research something that was put in 60-some years ago versus going over to the Home Depot and getting a replacement unit? How do you make those decisions?
It's a good question in several ways. People assume that the house makes demands of you in terms of maintenance and materials, and that you're somehow pressed to not do the natural thing, like you have a need for something, go down to Home Depot, or you need something done or repaired. You have a friend who has a very good carpenter, he knows what to do. We just were aware that isn't what you do. As it happens, this house has required very little in the way of maintenance. It cost so much more than it was supposed to. The house, as you can see, is made of, it's all cypress, it's all stone, glass, wood, cement. That's it. The wood in this house, which is in very nice condition,
Yes.
was washed and waxed once in these 66 years. Once. And we never did anything in particular to avoid touching it or tell the kids not to pump their tricycles into it. Or, it has stood up very, very, very well. We just painted the ceiling for the second time in 66 years. The floors are concrete. They don't have to be sanded and varnished and whatever that people do. You put a little wax on every 10, 15 years. Wright's drawings, however, said you should wax the floor with S.C. Johnson wax.
Of course, his client.
You can use any wax you want. But when you do that and then polish them up with a buffer, they shine like Russian leather. They're quite beautiful. In those early years, our roads had not been paved. Little kids are running around. Late afternoon sun, dust or anything on the floor would show. And my wife said to him, Mr. Wright, when we're doing the addition, isn't there something we can do so it doesn't show all this stuff? He said, well, we can use terrazzo. It's expensive, but it doesn't show anything. And that's true. It's very expensive, but it doesn't show anything. So in the addition that he designed, we used terrazzo floors. Meanwhile, we discovered, you really don't have to polish them up like Russian leather. They look perfectly nice now. They get a little bit of wax every 10, 15 years. That's all they need. And if I had to do over again, I would use the concrete in the addition as well. So then there's stonemasonry. Well, once in a while you point up the stone. That's it. Nothing has been needed.
Where do you find people to do that, the craftspeople?
To do what?
To fix up the stone, for instance, or...
Pointing up a mortar joint? Well, it happens I have some information from preservation architects as to how to get the right color of the mortar. If you want the cement to look right, the match which you have to learn how to determine what the right color sand is and so on, which I know how to do. But again, it's an infrequent need. The house has radiant heat.
Radiant heat floors?
Radiant heat floors.
And they're still working?
Yeah.
That's great.
I never ever felt that the house was demanding things of us that were difficult to do or complicated. No, I have to admit, the things I want to do, for example, this house was designed to have a standing seam copper roof. In 1951, you couldn't get copper. There was a Korean War going on. Copper was not available. If you had been able to get copper, I couldn't possibly have afforded it.
Very expensive.
Very
yeah.
expensive. And also, along with the copper roof was a beautiful pyramidal boss's fascia, beaten copper. Lovely. Oh, and Mr. Wright said, okay, temporarily, since you can't get copper, we'll use red asphalt roll roofing. We'll roll it out in long horizontal lines. The seams will sort of echo what the copper seams might have done. That'll be okay. Someday, Roland, if you have the money, put the copper roof on. It'll make a gentleman of you.
That's a nice piece of advice.
So, some many years later, I was seriously considering gentlemanly status. However, the plain fascia and the absence of this beautiful decoration that was there really frustrated me. And I knew that he had occasionally done some kind of dentillation. I figured out a way of making a dental pattern that could be made in the mill, in the shop, easily. And I made a sketch, and I showed it to him. So he took it home. I'll let you know. He made a few changes in the dimensions on it. But he said, that's fine, do it. So that dentillated fascia is now part of this house, been part of this house since day one. And there it is, co-designed by Roland Reisley and Frank Lloyd Wright. So I decided that I'm not going to replace it. I'll stay above. We'll use the red roll roofing.
So what's up there now?
Red roofing.
Red roofing, okay. So, Roland, I wanted to ask, how many clients of Wright are still around like you?
About 2 years ago, the Wall Street Journal wrote a story for their magazine saying, here are the 5 remaining original clients of Frank Lloyd Wright still living in their original homes. I know that 2 of them are now gone, and I'm not sure if there are still 2 others or not.
Or not?
So there are either now 3 of us, or maybe fewer than 3 of us.
Well, I know that this community has its protections for the land, but do you have to do anything special to protect the house for the next 50 years? Are there preservation easements, or what is your plan for how that will work?
The Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy is very concerned with these things. I was the founder of the Conservancy about 30 years ago. Some of the early prairie houses in the Chicago area were being purchased by speculators in order to remove the artifacts. The art glass windows and furniture now had huge value on the market. You could sell windows and a couple of chairs for as much as somebody would pay for the whole house. So they were buying houses in order to strip out the artifacts. The Wright community became incensed. This is terrible. These things were designed to be specifically for those houses. They should remain there, and the houses should be preserved. So after a few ad hoc gatherings of homeowners and architects, we created this conservancy, the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, specifically to facilitate the preservation and maintenance of all of the surviving Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. And we've done pretty well. We really have managed to gather technical information, make it available for preservation and maintenance. When a building has been threatened, we've been able to stimulate local advocacy to find the support and preserve these houses. And we've really only lost a couple of houses over all these years.
So could someone come into this community and tear this house down and build something else?
No, for 2 reasons. What I was getting to, however, is that the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy is trying to get owners of Frank Lloyd Wright buildings to create preservation easements.
Yes, of course.
And we've been doing that. We have, I guess, about 15 or 20 easements now. I'm working on one, which will essentially protect the house in perpetuity, and it should be done. However, within our community of Usonia here, we have restrictive covenants which essentially require that any changes to the exterior of these buildings must be sympathetic to the existing structure and be approved by our board of directors as indeed sympathetic. We have 47 houses. Over these many years, all of them have had additions. They all started out with young families who eventually, when they had more money or more children, didn't want to leave, so the houses had to be enlarged. I know where those additions are. You won't see them because they truly are sympathetic additions.
Isn't that great? I mean, that is so common sense.
Yeah. So that has worked very well for us.
Well, thank you for considering a preservation easement, because that's one of the few things that has any legal protection for these houses.
Yeah. No, I've been working on it for a couple of years now with them. We're trying to iron out specific details of exactly what to preserve. I'm concerned that in this community, it's not possible for the house to become a house museum. When you can do that, you can do all kinds of preserving every last piece of furniture. I'm concerned that the house should be preserved to be lived in and to keep its essential character, but have some flexibility to accommodate the needs of someone else who will live here in the future. And trying to determine, well, how do you define that flexibility? Things like, well, in the bedroom wing, maybe a wall here or there could be removed to make it larger. I think that in the main part of the house, nothing should change. Again, furniture, do we want to landmark the furniture? I don't think so. But maybe we should. So those are the things that we're discussing.
Yeah, the furniture in these houses, as you said, I mean, there was that wave of people pillaging the houses.
Yes.
But also, there's just straight-out thefts where people have stolen this. And there was, of course, the robbery, I think, earlier this year.
At the Freedman House in Los Angeles.
Right, of all the stuff that was stolen from the warehouse out there.
You know, I think certain things should be, the dining table, for example, designed specifically, it should be preserved. Although Mr. Wright didn't necessarily think so. He once visited the Hannahs, and she was busy feeding children, infants, in a small kitchen. With little toddlers in these small kitchens with their high chairs and whatever, it's crowded. And Mr. Wright said, "Why aren't you using the dining table?" And she didn't want to damage the dining table. He said, "That's not right." They say that he then, with his ring, scratched the dining table. Said, "You meant to use it, and if it gets worn out, you replace it."
Only he could get away with that, right? Somebody else coming in there and scratching up the dining room table is not going to fly.
Right.
Roland, thank you for your time this afternoon. This has been lovely, and just hearing your history with the house and with Wright is fascinating.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, this has mostly been small talk. I often tell the story of Usonia and the history, in a more linear fashion, but I guess there's something about just the random chatter that is.
Well, that's what we're good at, Roland. Random chatter. That's our show.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Happy to do it.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Marnist Radio is underwritten by Nichiha.com/US Marnist and by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, take us home, Tom.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.6 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. Contact George at usmodernist.org or on Instagram at mr.modernism. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Our esteemed guests get thoroughly Googled by Chief Researcher Sandy Stratton, not her real name, from her secret underground bunker. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another surprise episode of U.S. Modernist Radio.